Required Listening, the weekly show for and by web students and teachers. I'm your host, Professor Zach Gordon, and this week we're going to be talking about the topic of student web hosting. Special thanks to our sponsor Wistia for their amazing video hosting service and JavaScript API, which we use to publish this show. Let's start off with talking about what's going on around DeBrook. DeBrook.org is the site I use to publish my web education materials, and recently I've been working on a responsive design for 2012. And this theme is almost done and it's almost ready to go. In fact, I think it will be launching in this next week, so I'm very excited for that. It's looking good and excited to be following the standard of what's becoming a responsive design, and it's going to look great across all the devices. So that's going on. Also, I've been working on more video navigation, been having some issues with some of the podcasts and some of the video that I've been working on. This has been a little bit too long, and when it gets buffered online, certain sections of it, you might try to link to 5 minutes and 23 seconds, but you can't actually do that because that moment doesn't actually exist to be able to link to, so you have to link to 5 minutes and 22 seconds or 5 minutes and 21 seconds. So I've been working with some different solutions on how to do that, including creating a wrapper class that could make video navigation easy depending on whether or irregardless of what video hosting you're using. So we use Wistia on the show, but I also wanted to be able to work with YouTube. I've been experimenting with that, as well as if you're just hosting it on your own and using a different player like JW Player or something like that. So that's been what's been going around DeBrook.org. To move on to the topic of our show today, which is student web hosting, in this section we're going to talk about going into depth on a particular web topic, which in this case is student web hosting. And the reason that we start with this, we're at the beginning of Season 3, which is aimed at web educators out there. And when you're planning and setting up and teaching a web education course, it's a requirement that your students are going to be building some sort of website. Now, in a lot of schools, they're using either local access, so you save your HTML files on a flash drive, and then you just click and you open them up in the browser, and that's your experience of hosting your files. A lot of other schools will have internal hosting setups, so they will have servers that the school runs, and a lot of times these are antiquated or just kind of hacked together in order to host the most basic HTML and sometimes some server-side files. The other approach that some schools will take is buy a shared hosting account for all of their students to do and just kind of slice that up amongst students. It's a common approach you see some places. And there's very few institutions out there that actually invest in modern virtual servers or a dedicated system that really mirrors what you would see in the real world if you were hosting a real website for a company or an organization or something like that. So the reason I think that this is important to talk about is that part of the web education process should be learning how to work with a modern web server. It's very important that we not only learn how to design these sites, but that we learn how to deploy them. And this can be a place where often, a new web designer, a student builds a site for a client or builds a site for a project, but then they get stuck because that step of how to launch it, what do I do to get a domain name and set it up, and what's hosting, and how do I have to go about all that, how do I get the FTP information that I'm used to just being provided with, is an important thing that they need to learn so that when they go out and start deploying real sites that they'll be able to do that easily. That's kind of why I see this as an important topic to talk about. So to break down this discussion a little bit more, there's some key terminology that we need to know, and it's going to start with disk space and bandwidth. Now, disk space is the size of the server allocation that you have allotted to you, and very commonly this is a very small amount of space. You'll see some hosting companies out there that advertise unlimited disk space, and if you read the fine print, you actually don't get completely unlimited. A lot of times there will be limitations on that for what type of files you're storing and exactly how they're being used, etc. But the nice thing about the web is because we optimize our content, meaning that when we put up an image, we don't put it up at full resolution. So an image may be hundreds of megabytes when we first get it, but we bring it into Photoshop or image editing software and we compress that down so that we get it down to just a few kilobytes, maybe 20 or 30, and it'll load a lot faster. Now the nice thing is that when we optimize our content, it means that we don't need as much storage space. So whereas if we were looking at a thumb drive now, we might say, oh, 8 gigabytes, 20 gigabytes, 50 gigabytes is common just to be carrying around on a flash drive. But that amount of data that amount of space is very rarely needed for a hosting account. And in fact, with most of the student hosting that I've done, if they're optimizing their content well, 1/4 of a gigabyte, so just 250 megabytes, is usually enough to host all your projects for the semester, as well as some other side projects that you're working on. So when you're looking for a hosting account for students, or you're setting up hosting accounts, my suggestion is you start somewhere around this amount of, just 1/4 gigabyte. You don't need to give them a whole lot of disk space. If you have the space and you want to give them 500 megabytes, that's good. But I wouldn't encourage you to allocate too much space. Now, it's important that you educate. Part of the education process for the students is that you're telling them how the disk space works, and especially emphasizing to optimize that content. So whether it's images or videos or whatever they're doing, whatever they're putting up there, you want to make sure that whatever they're storing online is just the optimized content. So if there's a PSD for a project, for example, you'd store that on your computer or save it locally, but you wouldn't upload that to the server. Now, if the students need shared spacing or they need hosting space to just store files, that's kind of a different issue. We're talking specifically about hosting web content. So that's the basics of disk space. Again, you shouldn't need a whole lot. What I usually recommend and set up for students is about 256 megabytes, or about 1/2 gigabyte, and that tends to get them well through the semester, as well as host a few small projects. Occasionally, a student will try to upload a bunch of images, and when you go in and you see what they've done, you take them aside and you talk to them again about web optimizing. But again, if that's part of the instruction, it shouldn't be an issue with server size, set up that size. That's disk space. Talking about bandwidth. So bandwidth is the measurement of the size of files that you both uploaded and downloaded from your site. So when you go to upload something to your website, let's say you're going to upload an HTML page and a few images. The size of that HTML page, let's say it's 3 kilobytes, and the size of all the images, let's say that they're 600 kilobytes together. When you upload those using FTP to the server, which we'll talk about in a moment, all of that counts as part of your bandwidth. So again, it's the measurement of everything uploaded and downloaded. Now, if you go to upload that image again, or you go to upload that page again, that will count again towards your bandwidth. So every time you upload a file, that counts towards your bandwidth. Likewise, every time you download a file, that also counts. Now, downloading can count in terms of FTP, but most commonly, when you download a file, you're actually viewing it in the web browser. And what the server is doing is it's taking it from your disk space and it's displaying it to the browser there, and that process of displaying it to the browser is part of downloading this file, and that also counts for your bandwidth. So the way to figure out how much bandwidth you really need is if you look at your web page. Your web page is, let's say, a certain size, and all the images on your page and your CSS. If you add all of that up together, and let's say everything in one page that you either link to or embed in the file, let's say that adds up to 200 kilobytes, 300 kilobytes. Well, every time somebody downloads or visits that page, they're going to take away 200 kilobytes worth of bandwidth from your allocation. Now, the nice thing is that if it's cached in the browser, and we're not really going to go into caching, but caching is what a browser does to save that content, so it doesn't have to re-download it every time. So for example, if you link to jQuery on code.jquery.com, and somebody comes to your site, they've downloaded code.jquery.com, and then they go to another site that links to jQuery at code.jquery.com, it's already going to be saved on their computer, and they don't download it again. So if on your home page you have a slideshow of images and then they navigate to some other pages and then they come back to that home page, chances are that those images are going to be cached and they won't count again towards that download. But in general, every time you upload something to your site or every time somebody visits your site, that's going to count towards your bandwidth. Now, how much bandwidth do you need? Again, it's measured in megabytes and gigabytes. And my recommendation is if you can get a gigabyte of bandwidth allocated, that's probably going to do pretty well. Now, if you're looking at an average size site for, let's say, something that students are doing, the only people really visiting, not an average site, but an average project that students are doing, the people that are going to be visiting are them, their teacher, and maybe some classmates. Maybe they share a link with a friend. There's not too much traffic. Maybe let's say it's 4 or 5 people that will visit this a few times when they want to look at it, preview it, and they want to, or the teacher needs to grade the assignment. So that's not too much traffic. But if you're hosting a client site, having a gigabyte of space for an average site, let's say it's 5 pages and it has some well-optimized images, maybe one video in there, that should get you well around a couple hundred visitors over the course of a month. So again, to start up with your student web hosting account, if you allocate them 250 to 500 megabytes of disk space and somewhere around a gigabyte of bandwidth, that should be enough allocations for them to be able to use through the semester. They even have a few side projects that they share with other people. And even if this allocation was applied to a basic website, let's say, maybe not your teaching site, but a small business brochure site or something like that, these allocations should be good enough to get you going. Now, what happens when you go over your bandwidth? Depends on how your server is set up, but commonly you'll get an error message saying you have exceeded your bandwidth allocations. Please contact the server administrator. So you also want to prepare your students and educate them on the process of what's going to happen if they go over their allocation. Now, sometimes web hosting companies will charge you extra if you go over your bandwidth usage. Sometimes they won't charge you extra, but they'll just automatically upgrade you to the next level account. Really good hosting companies, though, will notify you of it and give you some time to decide what you want to do, whether it's just a fluke and they might charge you a small fee or maybe let you slide, or whether you really need more bandwidth or disk space allocated, and then they'll upgrade you to that account. So make sure whenever you're signing up for a company that you know what's going to happen if I go over. And it's very standard to just have a message displayed saying you've reached your allocation, contact the server administrator, and then they will make that decision. So the next thing to talk about here is how are they going to be accessing their server? Most commonly, for most web design classes, all they're going to need is FTP access. So it means you download an FTP client, something like FileZilla is a very common one because it works in both Windows and Mac. There's a Firefox plugin called FireFTP. And then there are some really great Mac-only ones, like, for example, I really like Transmit by the company Panic. That's a really great FTP client. But whatever they choose, CyberDuck is another popular free Mac client. Whatever FTP client they choose, they're going to need a few pieces of details. They're going to need the server that they're accessing, and most commonly this is a domain name, so zgordon.welovewebdesign.com, something like that. It may be an IP address, so they just type in an IP address and then they'll enter in a username and a password. So that's usually all you need: the address that you're accessing, your username, and your password. Now when you log into this, depending on how it's set up, you may already see a whole bunch of folders there, and you're going to want to upload your content to something called HTTP docs or public HTML or www. Depending on how the server is set up, there may be one folder in specific that you need to put all of your content into to make sure that it's publicly viewable. Now again, depending on how your servers are set up, you might not need to do any of that. But when you're talking to students and they're going through this FTP process, make sure to let them know about how this may look on a few other web hosts. So if they're on a Windows host, or if they're hosting with a different company, or if you've made special arrangements for how their server is set up, make sure to tell them about how this may look in other situations, because if they get into an environment that looks different, when they're working or doing a side project for a client, you want them to be prepared and not choke or upload their stuff to the wrong folder. So that's important to talk about. Now, if you're teaching a development class or a content management system in your class, they may need another level of access to something like PHPMyAdmin or cPanel or Plesk, or one of these control panels that are used to monitor the server and to allow you access to different functions within the server. cPanel is my favorite. It's one of the most common ones out there, and it's nice because most places that someone's going to go to host, they're going to have something similar to it. Some companies will have their own native or proprietary software that they use. For example, Media Temple, if you go with their basic grid service, they have a custom control panel that they've set up. And you're going to want to take, an hour or so and walk your students through all these different options, showing them what the different buttons do and what can get them in trouble to do and what fine using. But it's less common that you're going to need to give them this level of access to the control panel or direct access to the server. Now, if you're working with technology like Ruby on Rails or something that uses command line, you may also have to give them SSH access, which allows you to enter from the command line and control the server without a GUI at all. So those are kind of the different levels of access, but most commonly in a basic web design class, all you need for them is FTP, but make sure that you talk to them about what these different folders might look like, where to upload their stuff, and how to use an FTP client. Finally, a small note here just about supported languages. If you're going to be teaching HTML and CSS, most all servers will process that just fine. But if you're teaching PHP or you're teaching Python or Ruby on Rails, you're going to need to make special you're going to have to make sure that the server supports it and that those languages are installed on your server. There's nothing worse than realizing that you're teaching a PHP course and the server running on the school is a Windows server and you can't run PHP on it. So make sure that you set all of that up ahead of time before the semester starts so that you know that what you're teaching will be supported on the server. So that's just an overview of things that you need to know about the server itself and some of the related technologies. Now let's talk about the server setups. The most common type of server setup is a shared hosting account. And what this means is that you have a dedicated computer, and on it it has a bunch of folders in it, and each one of those folders is a different website. So where you might have a C drive on your computer, you might have your sites folder on your Mac. Each one of those folders would be set up on the server to be its own website, and you'd log in and get access to that. The benefit of this is that shared hosting accounts are very, very cheap. The disadvantage is that they're not as secure and they don't allow you to do some more complex features that may be helpful for a teacher setting up a course. So let's say, for example, you have 30 students in your class and you have a shared hosting account. What do you do to give them all access? Now, for a lot of what I've done, I've used the domain name welovewebdesign.com, and originally what I did was each person had a folder in that, and then they'd have FTP access that gave them access just to that one folder. Now, the problem with this is that it opens up some security problems where if they were to be able to get out of that one folder, they have access to that whole root level server. This didn't really happen except for one or two situations, but I began to steer away and encourage others not to take this approach of just giving each student a folder. The next level, which is actually technically very similar but looks a little bit different, is giving them each a subdomain on that same domain. Right? So shared hosting account will let you set up subdomains and it'll let you give them a different login for each one of those subdomains. And that's kind of the extent that you have with the shared hosting account. Now, the next level of setup is a virtual server, or VPN or VPS. And what this is it's one computer, but it has virtualized operating systems running on it. So on one computer it might have 4 different operating systems running, similar to that if you have a Mac and you install Parallels on it, that's a virtual operating system. And with a virtual operating system, instead of just having one folder, you have a whole install, a whole kind of mini server set up within that larger computer. It's much more secure, and it gives you some more flexible abilities. For example, if you have a VPN, you could actually set up a shared hosting account for each one of your students. And this is what I would recommend. The costs for VPNs are usually about 4 times more than a shared hosting account. But the benefit is that you're going to get the ability to easily set up secured shared hosting accounts for each one of your students. So when you set up an account for a student and you're on a VPN, you might set it up to look like a subdomain. So it might be zgordon.welovewebdesign.com, but instead of it being a subdomain, it's actually a complete shared hosting account set up just for that domain. And it might look like a subdomain, but it's really treating it as its full own domain. They can't get access to anything else. They could have their own control panel access, and they could have their own access to FTP. And if they mess anything up on that, it's not going to affect your other servers. The other nice thing about this is that if they go over their bandwidth allocations for their setup within a VPN, it's only going to affect their account. However, if you give each person a folder or a subfolder in your shared hosting account, that's a combined bandwidth allocation. So you can't say this person can only get this much bandwidth. So if one student uploads a bunch of stuff and visits all the time, it's going to affect all the students in your class. And that was actually the problem I ran into at most, and why I switched to using a VPN setup. The final setup is a dedicated server, and what this is it's the entire server. It lets you, instead of running a virtualized instance, run the entire box, and it's just going to give you one extra level of control. But in my experience, it's very rare for a teacher to really need a dedicated server setup. It might be more if an institution is investing, or schools that host their own web servers. They'll have a dedicated server, and then they can set up instances for different teachers, or however they want to allocate that. But dedicated servers are commonly well over $100 a month, so for an average web program, that's probably going to be more budget than one, you can spend, and two, you really need to spend. So those are your options for setting it up. And again, I would recommend that you get some sort of VPN for your student, for your whole program or your whole class. Now, recommendations: who to host with, who not to. Back in season 2, a while ago, we did an episode just on what hosting companies we recommend and which ones we don't. So you can go back to that, and the idea of this wasn't really to get into too much depth on the different companies, but I want to talk about one in specific. And that one in specific is the Student Web Hosting Company, and you could find them at studentwebhosting.co. And this is a company that I helped start, and it really grew out of years of my own experience setting up hosting for my students. Over the years, I began to know other teachers and other students who also needed hosting, so I'd let them host with the server that I had set up. Okay, so I had a situation where I had more students who I did not know directly, and teachers who were referred to me, coming to me, asking for setup and space, either for their class or for just themselves. As well as some students who had graduated and were going on and wanted expanded accounts, things like the ability to do reselling. So I decided that it would probably be better to create a company to handle this rather than just kind of doing it on my own on the side. And that's when the Student Web Hosting Company was born. And as I looked more into it and did more research, I found that there really is a missing niche out there for reliable student hosting that's set up just for students. And what you normally find when you look at companies is that some companies have free accounts for students, which is great. And there's only one other company I found, which is based out of England, that had accounts that were very affordable. But what I was able to do was I was able to give hosting accounts that were very low margin, profit margin for myself and for my business, but you couldn't beat them. So you have accounts that, something like GoDaddy or DreamHost that are $6, $8 a month, and you get quote-unquote unlimited storage and bandwidth and all of those things. But what I was able to do is set up accounts for just $1 a month and allocate just the allocations that a student would really need. So the Student Web Hosting Company, now, for example, the Beginner Web Designer package has 500 megabytes of disk space, has a gigabyte of bandwidth, gives you FTP access, and it's $1 a month. You can't beat that. And the support you're going to get isn't the same level. It's rapid email support, but it's not 24/7 call center and tier level hosting support and that kind of stuff. But for an average student, they don't really need that. Going up from there, I also had $25 a year accounts that were for people that needed cPanel access, that are doing programming, web programming, or needed databases or running content management systems. And again, that's a price that you can't beat out there. And then the space where it began to be, where I was running into competition with some of these bigger hosting companies, was a freelancer account. And this was for $50 a year. And what this allows you to do is get even more space, but it allows you to set up accounts for clients. Right? So if you want to host multiple domain names and do it the right way, and although you can find something a little bit cheaper and do something similar here, what I found is that students who had been hosting with me for 2, 3, 4 years, and were going on and wanted something bigger, they didn't want to have to deal with migrating, and they didn't want to have to do these other stuff. So they were willing to pay the same price they might find somewhere else to get the same service and not have to go through that migration process. And really, that was created as a service for them. I'm not really out there trying to target reseller hosting accounts. Then the final package, and this one was really just geared towards teachers, which is a bigger account that will let you, if you have 25, 30 students that you need to set up your accounts for, or even if you have 50 or 60 or more, this one is really set up for teachers that want to create multiple other accounts. So it's more than a reseller, but it's really geared to those teachers. And where you might be able to get something that compares with price, you're not going to get people that have the experience of giving you advice on how to set these up, how to run your hosting for students, and give you that support from the educator's perspective. And again, I can't compete, and I'm not really trying to compete in the hosting market, but I do want to provide a service that's just out there for educators. So if you are an educator and you're watching this and you're in a position where you have some budget, or you could get some budget allocated to be able to run your own hosting, I really encourage you to be able to do that, because what you're going to be able to get is definitely going to be better than probably the server that the school is running, or they're shared a hosting account that they bought. So that service is really there for them. And if you don't want to deal with the hassle of having to set it all up yourself, then you could refer your students to get those basic $1 a month plans, and I will set it up for you, make sure that it's secure, give them all the FTP information that they need, and handle the security and support issues there. So that's really the idea behind and the company, the Student Web Hosting account. So I'd really like you, to come check it out. It's at studentwebhosting.co. And again, I'm making very, very little money for this. It's more just providing a service that is needed for students and educators out there that need web space. Who's using this right now? There's a number of people, teachers at different universities around the country. All of them are US based at the moment. There are a few students based abroad. I have a number of students that I formerly taught that still have accounts, like I said, a few dozen that have freelancer accounts. And right now there's close to 200 different students running on the server, and it's allocated to take much more. It's in the cloud, so it's scalable, and no one hosting account is going to affect another one. So you're really going to get some quality hosting. There's other people that are using it. You get good support, and again, you get the support of someone who has experience teaching and setting up hosting accounts for students. So that kind of wraps up our topic today of the student web hosting and how to go about it, what the students need to know, what tips you might want to give them on setting up their accounts, and then where can you get it. So again, studentwebhosting.co, or just Google search for hosting for web students. So let's move on then to our section, Learning on the Web. And in this part of the show is where we talk about sites and resources that you could use online to enhance your own education. Or if you're an educator, something that you can encourage your students to look at, or something you could look at to kind of help structure your classes and stay a few steps ahead of your students as you're preparing. So the first one I want to talk about is Treehouse, the group by Carsonified, teamtreehouse.com, and what's really exciting by them is that from them is that they now have student prices, not student hosting. And for just $9 a month, it was formerly $25 a month, you could get full access to everything. You have to be a current student, but again, you just can't beat those folks for what they do. They provide great quality resources, they have fun interactive badges, and after you complete the badges, you get a profile that you could share with employers to show, not only have I learned this in a school and have that, but I have completed professional training and have the my profile to prove that, and you could show what badges you've completed and courses you've completed. So love those folks. Encourage you to contact them about getting a student hosting account set up, or a student account set up with Team Treehouse. And again, that's just $9 a month. In other Treehouse news, they have a new badge available for programming, the Objects, Classes, and Variables badge for programming. So we're going to want to go ahead and check that out. Related news, last time Kyle Cotter was our guest and he told us about CodeRace.me, which had just come out, and what this is a very cool website where you basically go and you're presented with a few tasks that you and another person online simultaneously work to complete and see who could finish faster. And there's weapons that you could use to slow down the other person, and there's some different stages that you could go through, different levels of coding. But this is just a really fun way, and I'd encourage you to start including this in your class, maybe as a warm-up activity or something you could give the kids to do to compete with each other, maybe challenge the teacher, something like that. I just see that there's a lot of space for this to be really fun. There's also a link that I'd like to share that goes a little bit into how they built this. Again, it's built by Carsonified. They built the whole application in 4 days using some really cool technologies. CoffeeScript, it's all running on Node.js, so it's live, responsive in the browser. And I mentioned I'm just really excited to learn more because I feel for grading student work, it really needs to be kind of this interactive model where they upload their code or type it in online and they get this instantaneous feedback. As a teacher, you don't have to read through source code. Let the programming do that for you. So CodeRace.me, go check it out. Very exciting, very cool stuff. And we'll have a link to a Vimeo video of kind of behind the scenes of them filming it. Next up on lynda.com, they have some new Drupal 7 videos for building custom themes. If you're getting into Drupal and you need to build a custom theme, maybe you've worked with WordPress, maybe you've never worked with anything before, I'd really encourage you to go get some sort of resources. And the lynda.com set you can find online, they just released it for Drupal 7 custom themes. So that's a great resource for you. They also had a new one come out on HTML5 messaging, which is really cool and exciting. One of the new technologies with HTML5 and WebSockets, the ability to do live chat and quicker interactive access for small bits of text. So if that's something that interests you or you'd like to know about, or you just want to become efficient in all the modern cutting-edge HTML5 stuff, another great resource there for you on lynda.com. Finally, I want to talk about a website that has been around before, but I just learned about it and kind of stumbled into it, and it's method.ac, or Method Action. And they haven't released it fully yet, but they have released a few cool games to test your more designer skills, so matching colors and doing cool things like that in creative, interactive ways. And what this site is set up to do is to teach developers how to design in an analytical way. What they say is you actually know how to design, and they haven't released it, as I said, but they have 50 missions, and it looks like a really cool interactive way to learn. And then the feedback and the grading process is done by peers and other people in it. So I see a really cool community coming up around that, and look forward to when that launches and being able to share that with you. So that's our show. Once again, I'd like to thank our sponsor of the show, Wistia. You can find them at wistia.com, and they are an amazing group of people who do video hosting, and their specialty is in analytics. They also have a great API that you could use, and it's what we use to publish all of our stuff here. They also have a really entertaining blog and produce some good videos, so I encourage you to go check them out at wistia.com and learn more about the company. Now, this isn't a budget that a lot of students are going to be able to afford, but I encourage you to keep Wistia in the back of your mind so the next time that you need professional hosting for a project, you know that you could go to them. So that's our show again. Thanks everybody for watching, and keep on learning.